Merci beaucoup. Encore une fois, un très grand merci pour cette invitation de venir ici à Québec. C'est un énorme plaisir pour moi de découvrir. C'est la première fois que j'ai la chance de venir au Canada et j'apprécie beaucoup aussi la beauté du paysage et tout ça. Donc vraiment très beau. Et comme j'avais dit déjà vendredi, on a aussi des liens institutionnels. Notre recteur est un ancien étudiant de Laval, ici, Michael Hengartner. Excusez-moi de parler en anglais, mais là, je dois dire que j'ai déjà une fois préparé ça en anglais. C'était un peu plus facile que de faire encore une traduction, mais vous pouvez toujours après aussi faire les questions en français. Je peux même parfois aussi faire des observations additionnelles en français. En tout cas, donc, Julien, and the Emperor Julian, a very fascinating person, I think, and I have a tendency also to apply what we today live, this sort of clash of civilizations, in a way what happened also in the 4th century after Christ, because I mean the Christians were there sort of in the situation of the Muslims of today, to exaggerate it in a way, but if you look at Julian, it becomes quite clear how brutal and how extreme the controversies have been there also sometimes. That it's a wide question, and of course there are resemblances and there are differences. We always have to make the nuances as well, but I think it's quite healthy also for us today in this situation, which many think is very dark and difficult, to know that there were at least comparable situations in our own tradition, in our own DNA of culture, so to say, where we had lived through similar periods as well. Looking now more precisely at Julian, it is quite illuminating to see how Julian, embarking on his all-out attack on Christianity, and this is text number 2 on your exemplier, he invokes the situation of a court of justice, dikasterion in fragment 2. He clearly understands himself as some kind of public prosecutor. The venue of his imagined lawsuit, however, is not a physical building, but rather the whole orbis terrarum, to which he is addressing his literary indictment. For Julian solemnly declares at the outset, and this is text number 1, that he will expose to all mankind the reasons by which he came to be convinced that the religion of the Galiléens is nothing other than the fabrication and forgery of men concocted out of villainy. As you see, there was no political correctness in this time, actually. And in scornfully using the locally restricted term Galiléens, et j'avais déjà fait une allusion à ça, enfin, vendredi, for the Christians, the emperor simultaneously discredits the new religion and their claim to a worldwide prevalent for its beliefs. This is a local phenomenon, the Galileans, from Galilea, and therefore that's where it should have remained, and he would be very happy to cope with it if it had remained in Judea and Galilee. Against the background of this setting, it is not surprising to find Julian pursuing a clear-cut rhetorical strategy. Throughout the first book, which is dedicated mainly to the Old Testament, he compares and contrasts the Hebrew and the Greco-Roman traditions in the form of a contrastive comparison, anti-parabole in Greek, and aims thereby at amplifying and praising the latter at the expense of the former, which is the clear rhetorical strategy of auxesis or amplificatio versus meiosis or minutio. This rhetorical procedure, which had been recommended as early as by Anaximander and Aristotle, is particularly evident in the second main section of Book 1, which focuses on Moses' versus Plato's cosmogonical account. The third topic of this book, and this is text number 3, where you get something like a table of contents of what he's dealing with in the first book. The third topic this is the Christian's double apostasy from the pagan as well as from the Hebrew heritage is also based on contrastive juxtaposition. First of Roman religion, law, culture and civilizations as against the Old Testament, and then of common elements in both the Hebrew and pagan religions in contrast to the dreadful concoctions by the Christians. Only for the first topic listed in this précis of Book 1, the common origin and the origin of the common notion of the divine, in Greek this is ennoia theou, must it remain open for want of evidence whether or not the argument was also structured on comparison between pagan and Hebrew assumptions. Before entering into detailed discussion of Julian's core philosophical and theological arguments, it is important to call to mind the limits of our knowledge about his against the Galiléens. When we read at the beginning of fragment 2, which is text 2, that Julian intends in his discourse to deal with all their so-called teachings, it immediately strikes us how much of the work must actually be lost. We are, to be sure, rather well informed about Book 1, and this is due to the fact that the first 10 books which Cyril of Alexandria composed in order to refute the first book of Julian's pamphlet have come down to us in their entirety. Even here, however, it is far too optimistic to assume, with Neumann and other scholars, that the 89 fragments in Masarakia's edition and testimonies which can be gleaned from Cyril add up to virtually the entire first book, as also Augusto Guida, actually, who is an enormously important scholar, wanted to underline. Not only did Cyril avowedly censor defamatory statements about Christ and also eliminate redundancies which he claims to have found all over the first book, and he does sort of eliminate this by rearranging Julian's thoughts according to an order which he, Cyril, considered to be more appropriate. In carefully analyzing the fragments, it becomes, moreover, clear that he has left out substantial elements of Julian's chain of reasoning. One of the most striking examples, whereas the fragments contain significant evidence on Julian's contrasting theological statements by Plato and Moses, a previous chapter dedicated to the comparison of the Old Testaments with the pagan poets' theological views has been virtually lost. If it were not for Julian's letter 89b, a passage generally overlooked up to now, which clearly signals that this topic will be dealt with in a future work, hypermentuton idia beltion parastesai poso faulotteroi ton parhemin hutoi gegonasi poieton. If it were not for this passage, one could hardly hazard the opinion that fragment 4, which superficially seems surprisingly critical of monstrous Greek myth of the Orphic tradition, actually, this fragment 4 is very interesting for the two of us working in the Orphic section. This fragment is in fact only a poor remnant of this section. Even within the properly philosophical section of Julian's comparison, moreover, are there evident lacunae. Julian's quotations of Platonic key passages on the ontological nature of heaven in the Timaeus, adduced in fragment 8, for instance, lack today the comments which he usually adds after citations, and in which he would no doubt have underlined the unmatched sophistication of Plato's cosmogonical account. Similarly, in stylizing God's speech on the occasion of the creation of man in Genesis 1:26 to 28 as a counterpart to Plato's public speech, De Megoria, in which the demiurge addresses the lower gods created by him in the Timaeus 41a, Julian must presumably have insisted on the obvious inferiority of Moses' narration, a critique of which Cyril's paraphrase at the end of the quote offers us but a scanty glimpse. And since fragment 13 opens as follows, to these words compare the Jewish teaching and the paradise planted by God and Adam, fashioned by him, moreover the wife that he was given, the conclusion seems unavoidable that Julian must, at least at some point, have referred to the corresponding Platonic narrative of the creation of man in the Timaeus. I will come back to that. In fragment 19 again, not only the New Testament quotes, which Julian has said he will adduce to demonstrate Yahweh's exclusive care for Israel, but also the conclusions to be drawn from this set of quotations are merely adumbrated in Cyril's introduction and epilogue to the fragment, where he offers summaries of Julian's argument, partly in the latter's word, partly his own. Whereas, notwithstanding these and other lacunae, we still are in fact able to grasp the gist of Julian's argumentation in Book 1. We know disturbingly little about the second and virtually nothing about the third book of his Against the Galiléens. Allusions to Book 1 in fragment 50 following and fragment 64 point to Jesus' person, his miracles, and presumed divinity as main topics. The roughly 20 fragments which have come down to us mostly from Cyril's lost second decade of Contra Julianum and Theodoros of Mopsuestia's refutation confirm that the Gospels were at the heart of Book 2. And it is a reasonable conjecture that Book 3 would chiefly have dealt with the other writings of the New Testament, in particular the Acts of the Apostles and the Pauline letters. The preserved fragments suggest a special attention to alleged contradictions, in Greek diaphoniae. Yet Julian will hardly have confined himself to this rather philological topic. He must rather have scrutinized and attacked all the major tenets of Christian doctrine, focusing above all on Jesus' life and divine nature, as well as the depravity of his early and later followers. To sum up with a bold guess, today we may have a certain plausible idea of around 20 to 25% of the content and at best 15% of the wording of Julian's anti-Christian treatise, which is considerably more than what we know about Porphyry's Against the Christians. On a regardé à ça à vendredi en fait, parce que ça c'était la base de ce thème des un ou deux origines. But still, it's only a limited fraction. C'est plus ou moins le même chiffre que je dirais c'est pour Cels aussi. Donc Cels et Julien sont transmis un peu dans la même qualité, pour ainsi dire. Anyway, let us keep that in mind, that we do know so little about it, when we now try to discern the philosophical basis of Julian's anti-Christian polemics and the strategies adopted to achieve its goals. In what follows, the main focus shall be on his placing side by side, in Greek paratheinai, what is said about the divine among the Greeks and among the Hebrews. This is the second item of Book 1 and therefore of text number 3, fragment 3. This section, which covers fragments 5 to 46, is particularly instructive as for Julian's mindset, whereas the third chapter of the first book is basically an ongoing variation of his strong conviction of the unmatched superiority of Greco-Roman law, religious blessings and civilization vis-à-vis the Hebrew and particularly the depraved Christian tradition, and will therefore only selectively be considered in this talk. Julian's comparison of Hebrew and Greek theological statements ultimately boils down to Moses versus Plato, or more precisely, to a contrasting of the beginning of purportedly Moses' Genesis with Plato's dialogue Timaeus. It must have sounded particularly poignant and provocative to Christian ears that Julian exploits this comparison to ridicule the Mosaic text outright. Ever since the Judaic Hellenistic period, with Philo of Alexandria as the most important protagonist, the fusion of the two cosmogonic tales into one had become an essential element of the Jewish Christian worldview, and this programmatic amalgam remained highly influential well into early modern times. Yet, instead of reading Plato's philosophical approach into Moses' account of as those thinkers did, Julian savors touching on awkward features in Genesis 1:1 following and highlighting in serious its deficiencies. Moses, he insists in fragment 6, says nothing at all about the creation of the abyss, darkness and water, nor about the coming into being of the angels, but he takes only material bodies in heaven and on earth into consideration in his description. Moses' God, therefore, is definitely not the creator of any immaterial thing, which would deserve much more observation actually and attention, because this is what counts in a Platonic worldview, the immaterial things, and not heaven and earth. As I said in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. These are the visible things. And therefore, he's considered to be only an adorner of pre-existing matter. For according to Julian's most likely correct interpretation of the Greek translation of the Tohu Vabohu in Genesis 1:2, the Septuagint's version, the earth was invisible and unwrought, ahoratos kai akatas keuastos, actually refers to matter. Julian returns to his alleged Mosaic deficiencies at the beginning of the second subchapter in a rather peculiar fragment that deserves close scrutiny. This is text number 4 on page 2 and fragment 18. Starting, as it seems, on a conciliatory note and referring to true opinions in common, I quote, with regard to things about which those people, i.e. the Christians, as Cyril suggests, or the Hebrews, hold the right theological opinions and which our fathers have handed down to us from the beginning, our account runs as follows. The demiurge, who is directly concerned with this world, ... The sentence breaks unexpectedly off at this place. And then I conclude, Julian cannot resist immediately adding that Moses does not say anything about the realities that are ontologically above anotera, the obviously inferior demiurge, let alone that he didn't dare to talk about the nature of the incorporeal angels, whose existence is taken for granted, but no further specifications are given as to their origin or hierarchical position. Moses, Julian continues, just discusses heaven and earth and the things that are therein and how they were set in order. Again, however, no word on the spirit, pneuma, this higher and philosophically more important reality, other than what Moses tells us of his moving over the waters. It wouldn't come as a surprise if later in Julian's pamphlet this observation had been again adduced in discussing the Christians' doctrine of the Holy Spirit. But this remains, of course, speculative. At this point, Julian's critique aims at Moses' failure to go beyond the sensible world, or else where he does, talking about angels, conceive of super-sensible entities such as the angels or spirit, to give any explanation as to their origin or ontological rank. Much could be said at this point about how Jewish and early Christian intellectuals have dealt with these and other obvious gaps in Genesis 1:1 following, by either postulating that on the first day, which the Septuagint distinguishes from the other days by calling it day 1, hemera mia, the whole intelligible world had been created. This is the opinion of Philo of Alexandria. Or else that, on the contrary, Moses deliberately restrained from talking about the invisible entities, since the Israelites, having just left Egypt and its polytheistic religion, were not yet ready for such a refined doctrine. This is, for instance, the teaching or the view of Eusebius, Basil, Chrysostom, and Cyril himself. One might moreover add that even in Plato's account of the origin of the world, Timaeus is notoriously reluctant to go into details about the intelligible reality. Although the aeonta are identified as providing the model for the creation of his physical world, It is evidently not the key issue for Plato's mouthpiece Timaeus, whose focus is clearly on explaining the sensible reality, to quote Timaeus 27a, from the origin of the cosmos to the nature of man. A critic adopting Julian's stance toward the Mosaic text could therefore go as far as to similarly approach Plato, that in his famous public speech quoted by Julian in fragment 9, he said nothing about the intelligible realm, except for the elusive phrase gods of gods, theoi theon, in this speech 41a, a phrase which Julian actually disambiguates in his philosophical exegesis in fragment 10, boldly identifying the nominative theoi with the intelligible models of the visible stars and heaven, theon. It's very interesting, this explanation which he offers in this place. Be that as it may, it is more than obvious that from a philosophical point of view, Moses' plain narration is incomparable with Plato's much more refined likely story, by which he offers a kind of summa of pre-Socratic cosmogonical thinking. Julian therefore has an easy time of it in contrasting the two, moreover chronologically quite distant accounts, and revealing the many more weaknesses in Moses' presentation of the divine. Julian is particularly derisive with regard to the Mosaic creation of man, which he considers to be utterly mythical and conveying of a scandalous image of God. For apart from the fairy tale element of a snake talking to Eve, fragment 15, how could it have escaped an omniscient God that he created the wife not as a helper, as he intended, but rather as someone who would deceive Adam and contribute to the fall of both from paradise? Being good, how could God ordain by law that they may not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? For what could be of more value for men than to possess this practical wisdom, phronesis, as a basis also of human ethics? If these words about God, as Julian seems convinced, do not have a deeper meaning, here again, ici aussi on trouve ce qu'on a trouvé chez Porphyre, phaneros lechtenta. Pour cela, ce n'est pas justifié d'adapter ici une exégèse allégorique. It's the same thing for Julian. He's convinced that they do not have a deeper meaning. And if this is the case, they are full of blasphemy, presenting as they do an envious God who does not want humans to become immortal. It would be exciting to know how Julian himself thought concerning the origin of man. Cyril's quotations, it is true, do contain almost no trace of a positive anthropogony developed by him, but on the basis of the general line of thought, we may safely assume that such an anthropogony must have been based on the relevant passages from the Timaeus 41d following, creation of the divine part of the human soul by the demiurge himself, and 42e following, creation of the body and connection of body and soul by the lower gods. That is indeed precisely what is suggested by another passage in Julian's letter 89b. Et ça c'est texte numéro 5 sur votre exemplaire à la bas de la page 2 et page 3, in which he refers to a later treatment of this topic elsewhere, an allusion which Bede has plausibly connected with Julian's anti-Christian treatise. In this letter, he pleads against the, if not exclusively in this context, still primarily biblical idea of mankind as originating from one man and one woman. Instead, he favors a simultaneous coming into being of a great number of men and women in different places. This assumption, he explains, is not only warranted by ancient theological wisdom, which tells us that man originated from drops of blood which fell from heaven when Zeus was arraying the universe, but is also required, he says, by the facts. For had we originated from one man and woman only, neither could the huge diversity of laws be explained. a point on which Julian, as we will see, comes repeatedly back, nor how the whole world could have come to be populated. Impossible. They could have populated 1,000 times, but how do you fill the world? From one man and from one woman. That's how he says it. He makes a comparison to pigs, actually. Julian follows closely the account of Plautus' Timaeus when he goes on to claim that it was the lower ancestor gods, called Genearchai, who, having received the eternal souls from Demiurge, created mankind in a collective action. That's this passage here in Julian. Julian's handling of the Mosaic anthropogony was already marked by a stringent criticism and imbued with a good deal of sarcasm and contempt. But there was even more to come. Following a critical note regarding the fact that Moses obviously did not tell everything, even about the lower demiurge directly concerned with this world, Julian contends that the Mosaic God pays heed only and exclusively to the Hebrew tribe, caring nothing about other peoples. And he insists that the later prophets, as well as Jesus and even Paul, all quite confirm that Yahweh is the God of Israel and of no other tribe. Taking literally the biblical statements about God's special relationship to Israel, he reaches the rhetorically devastating conclusion that even on the basis of his opponent's own reference texts, it is to be excluded that Moses' God can be identified with the demiurge of this world. For if he were God of us all, and also our creator, how could he have then overlooked the rest of mankind for so long, i.e. till the arrival of Jesus? This would not have been fair. Such an action would definitely clash with one of the basic tenets of Platonic theology, which by Julian's lifetime had become standard not only in pagan but also in Jewish Christian metaphysics, that is, the unconditional and unchanging goodness of the divine. Therefore, he should have offered his salvation immediately to the whole world, and not just to the Hebrew people. No, the God of Israel is instead, in Julian's view, one of the many particular gods of which this world is full. He has been allotted a tiny strip of land, Judea, and he has already had a hard time of it governing and taking care of his own people, as we may gather reading the Old Testament, full of problems of this God with his people, let alone the whole world. His zeal and thirst of revenge are further proof of his being a particular and ontologically inferior deity. Such a picture of the Mosaic God, which incidentally comes surprisingly close to the consensus view in today's Old Testament research on Yahweh, is somewhat at odds with fragment 86, where Julian talks about his own ongoing worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. It must be said, however, et j'avais souligné ça aussi déjà vendredi, that a certain ambivalence regarding the Jewish heritage, depending on whether its commonalities with the Christian religion or rather with pagan cult are emphasized, is characteristic of the philosophical polemics against Christianity ever since Celsus. On instrumentalise ça. Les Juifs sont utilisés soit pour le propre point de vue, soit pour dénigrer la tradition. In fragment 86, Julian indeed appropriates Abraham, Isaac and Jacob as descendants of an old priestly tribe, the Chaldeans, which sacrificed to and worshipped God in the same way as he himself does, which means in erecting altars, building sacrificial places and venerating him as Abraham did with holy rituals. We know that Julian was particularly fond of offering sacrifices. On lit qu'il avait une quantité des hécatombes et tout ça, donc pour vraiment relancer le culte païen. A similarly harmonizing and accommodating view of the Hebrew God is to be found in the letter 89a, where Julian seems to concede that Yahweh is thought by the Jews to be the most powerful governor over the sensible world, whom we too, as I well know, venerate under other names. Ça, c'est donc le point positif, le point de vue positif de la tradition juive. Such a syncretizing approach seems to have been conceivable to Julian exclusively with regard to the Hebrew tradition, in particular in its oldest form. This is hardly surprising, since as long as the Jews remained a locally and numerically restricted community, it would have been easy, despite its pretended exclusiveness, to integrate their religion into the Roman Empire. Such was the case with so many other local cults. Indeed, at the end of fragment 28, ça c'est texte numéro 6 à la page 4, Julian seems to imply that he has no qualms about respecting Yahweh too as a particular God. With St. Paul opening up the Jewish faction of followers of Jesus to the non-Hebrew world, however, things had radically changed. It now became vital to dismantle the Old Testament as being the foundation of the New. That is why Julian is so eager to point out deficiencies and even plainly subversive evidence in the Pentateuch. One further item which he picks up in this regard is the story of the Tower of Babel, which as an ideological myth is completely unsatisfactory in Julian's eyes, since it explains only the diversity of languages and says nothing whatsoever about the, in his eyes, much more important legislative and socio-cultural differences between the ethnic groups of the world. On pourrait dire, nous on est habitués au linguistic turn, et donc que le langage c'est une chose très importante, tandis que pour Julien, on a vu ça déjà aussi dans le contexte de Porphyre, ce sont les nomoi qui sont essentiels, ta patria. Donc ça c'est la tradition, la différence dans la législation, dans les coutumes et tout ça. Et de ça, ce texte de l'Ancien Testament sur la chute de la tour de Babel dit absolument rien. Et pour lui, ça c'est la raison pourquoi ça n'a aucune valeur. And whereas later theologians will explain the plural usage at Genesis 11:7, come, let us go down, and confuse their language as an allusion to the Trinity, Julian takes it for a proof that Moses was in fact well aware of the existence of other gods and simply wished to conceal the fact. Julien further expatiates on this later on in Book 1, when dealing with the Christians' claim that they were the true Israelites and that Moses had foretold the future birth of Jesus. Arguing against such Christian pretension of a tropological exegesis, Julien outlines a Mosaic theology that includes a variety of other divine figures, angels, lords, and in particular a number of gods, theus pleionas. On pourrait aussi de nouveau penser là au traité periton daimonon, comme on avait vu là dans la tradition païenne. Pas de souci de parler de ces notions de créatures intelligibles, intermédiaires. And this is in fact what he sort of supposes that Moses would have thought, that he would have said, yes, of course, that the most divine, the highest is only one in a henotheistic tradition. But underneath there are various divine figures, as I said, angels, lords, and many gods, theus pleionas, with the first and one God, however, as singular summit of the ontological hierarchy. Quote, Moses did not assume another second God, be he like or unlike. Homoion, homoousios, ça c'est déjà ici aussi dans un point de vue important. As you have elaborated, there is not a single phrase in Moses that would evince that God had a son. Julien goes on to demonstrate, quoting a great number of Old Testament passages, most of which he considers irrelevant or else altered and forged by the Christians in order to serve as alleged predictions of Christ as creator of the universe. Julien does in fact also find proof of lower divinities in the Mosaic tale of the sons of God who mixed with the daughters of men, producing giants as offsprings. This is Genesis 6:1 following. In these sons of the God, he sees immortal angels and identifies them with the gods who, in his view, govern the various tribes. When Moses does not hesitate to mention these lower divinities, why would he have refrained from revealing the Son of God to mankind? Therefore, ça c'est pour lui donc l'épreuve que cet important élément de la pensée chrétienne que Jésus, en tant que créateur du monde, a été annoncé par l'Ancien Testament. Donc la lecture tropologique de l'Ancien Testament, ça ne marche pas du tout dans les yeux de Julien. Il veut vraiment laisser ça de côté. It is quite revealing to see how Julian, in this section of Book 1, tries to stylize the Mosaic theology as closely as possible to his own Platonic one, with the clear intention of discrediting as a patent fabrication the Christian doctrine of a firstborn son or divine logos. Whereas in this context, Julian refers to Matthew 28:19, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit, as being in blatant contradiction to Moses' commandment to believe in the one and only God. It is unsurprisingly the beginning of St. John's Gospel with its deliberately philosophical claim that meets Julian's most vigorous resistance. I will not go into detail here for reasons of time, because I know we have to respect the schedule, and just briefly summarize Julian's observations. Actually, you find that in the texts 8 and 9, fragment 79 following, where Julian, on the one hand, he has a crushing criticism based on John's elevating of Jesus, who in that evangelist is ultimately identified with the divine word and creator of the universe. And he also insists on the literary strategies employed by John to convey this message, because he offers a really detailed philological analysis, says that at the beginning with these 5 verses, very general on the Logos, this is acceptable in his views, of course, because as Amelius had accepted the prologue of St. John, he would have accepted that as well. But then surreptitiously he tries to identify this Logos with the historical person of Jesus Christ, and he does not even do it in his own words, but he uses a sort of a prosopopoia in having St. John the Baptist of saying that, and immediately retracting at the end, saying, but no one has ever seen God. If he is God, then you have seen him. This is already a contradiction in this short text. It's therefore a very clear sort of philological analysis, and if one looks at modern commentaries on St. John's prologue, one finds that also theologians have quite difficulties in precisely analyzing the sort of the development of thought, and they work with sort of earlier elements inside a Jewish hymn, integrating and things like that. Be it as it were, in other words, Julian finds philosophical valuables, ideas in this text, which on principle he may have accepted in the wake of Amelius, cleverly mixed up with the basic error of the Galilean religion, which wants Jesus to be God himself and demiurge. This unabashed confusion is what makes him so outraged at this point. He uses the word panurgos, and schurke, what is in English again, ou en français en tout cas, c'est le pire qu'on peut utiliser. C'est vraiment un méchant comme tout. He uses this only in another passage on St. Paul, because as I said also already on Friday, St. Paul for him is horrible because he has opened up the Jewish Christian tradition to the whole world in renouncing to make the ritual observations. Orthodox Christian theology is, in short, for in the eyes of Julian, basically flawed and caught in 2 category errors. In Julian's eyes, it is more than evident that neither Jesus Christ nor the God proclaimed by Moses is to be put on a level with the demiurge of the world. As for the latter, he writes in fragment 28:8 following, this is text number 6 at the end of page number 4, if he, Moses, worships a particular God and attributes to him the governance of the universe, it is better to listen to us and both recognize the God of all things and not ignore the other. than to venerate the one that has been allotted to govern an extremely small part instead of the demiurge of all things. As can be grasped from this and many other fragments, Julien, in his Against the Galiléens, does not stop at criticism of his opponents. He offers many clues as to his own philosophical theology, which is essentially based on Plato's Timaeus, but also includes other Platonic and Platonist doctrines, in particular of Iamblician stamp. Most attention is paid to the great demiurge around which heaven eternally rotates. He is repeatedly called the one directly concerned with this world, ho proseches tou kosmou tou demiurgos, a specification characteristic of Julien, which leaves no doubt that, notwithstanding its foremost importance both in Plato's Timaeus and in Julien's religious thinking, he is not at the pinnacle of the ontological pyramid. There are rather higher realities to which Julien in the preserved fragments briefly alludes when criticizing Moses for having written nothing concerning ta anotero tutu. This is fragment 18, text 4 on page 2. Since there is nothing to find in Moses about these superior beings, Julien does not need to discuss them in his Anti-Parabole either. As for the realm controlled by and beneath the demiurge, the interpretation of the public speech in the Timaeus plays a key role for Julien. According to fragment 10, this is text number 7 on page 4, the demiurge is the creator of both the intelligible models, archetypa, and of the images of these models, that is, sun, moon, stars, and heaven. These cosmic gods, in turn, are called up by the demiurge to serve as secondary demiurges below him and generate all that is destined to be mortal. For if the great demiurge were the cause of everything, only immortal things would be produced, which is obviously impossible. In underlining the consequences from the cause-effect chain, ontologically different realities must have different causes. Julien implicitly also censures Moses' account as being much too crude and philosophically incapable of explaining the basic diversities. In fragment 21, and this is text 10 on page 7, blending two of the most famous sayings from the Platonic corpus, Timaeus 28 and the second epistle, Julien declares as basic premise of the pagan tradition which he proudly professes that the demiurge is the common father, the terminology from the Timaeus, and king of all things, terminology also from the Republic, but in particular from the second letter. The intelligible gods below him are in this place called rulers of nations and guardians of cities, et narchai kai poliuchoi theoi. I quote, every one of them administers his own lot conforming to his nature. For in contrast to the Father God, in whom everything is perfect and all is one, these inferior gods are divided and particular, and they leave their individual imprints on the people they have been allotted, with Ares, for instance, ruling over the bellicose, Athena over warriors with acumen, and so forth. Elsewhere too, Plato talks about the distribution by lot of the earth among the gods, most notably in the dialogue Critias. But it is thanks to an allusion to our treatise in Julien's letter 89b, text 5, I have already mentioned this passage before, where these gods are called first ancestors of the lineage, genearchai, as we have seen, that we can identify them with the auxiliary intelligible theoi of the public speech in the Timaeus. As we have seen, Julien states in this place that these gods, having received immortal souls from the demiurge, all at once created their respective people, and it is this origin, according to Julien, that also explains the variety of laws and customs, a point to which he repeatedly returns when talking about the ethnarch gods in Galiléens. For he, as an emperor, highly sensible to the diversity of the cultural souls, one might say, of this huge empire, of his ethnic groups. He's convinced that, as opposed to what the tale of Babel suggests, the heterogeneity of customs and laws is not the result of a hazard, but rather witnesses to the divine providence administrating over the world. Fragment 26, which is text 11 finally, complements the picture of Julian's onto-theology, closing the gap between the particular gods and human beings with a subtle gradation of further divinities, ranging from angels downwards to demons and specific kinds of souls which assist and render services to the stronger powers. On the whole, such a refined ontological system, which echoes ideas known in particular from Porphyry and Iamblichus, comes strikingly close to the hidden theology, which Julian in his treatise unveils in Moses, extrapolating, as we have seen from the plural in Genesis 11:7, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language," a plurality of gods, and mentioning not only Moses' angels and lords, but even identifying these with the ethnarch gods. Cyril was not in the end being that obtuse when he singled out as cross-cutting core topic of the highly literary suit Julian brings in his Against the Galiléens, its assertion that their theological doctrine, I quote Cyril now, goes wrong as against the teaching of both pagans and Hebrews by A, neither admitting many gods, polytheistic of course, nor indeed one only according to the Mosaic law, but confessing three instead of one, as said Cyril in parentheses here, for he believed perhaps that the holy and consubstantial Trinity, or more precisely the nature of one single godhood, would be cut up in three gods by us. Ça, c'est clairement aussi une longue discussion là, de la discussion de la Trinité. On peut même mentionner que dans le Coran, ça c'est aussi une critique faite au christianisme, qu'on a un trithéisme dans notre tradition. On voit comme c'était déjà là tellement présent. En tout cas, je vous remercie beaucoup pour votre attention.